Our first keynote speaker is truly an inspiration for proponents of the classical liberal values of personal freedom and economic liberty. An economist by training, he is a vocal advocate of the economic truths discovered and reported by Adam Smith, Friedrich Hayek, and Milton Friedman. His faithfulness to the principles of classical liberalism make him a true heir to the legacy of America's founding fathers. His election as president of the Czech Republic in 2003, along with his re-election as Czech president earlier this month, are real-world proof that personal freedom and economic liberty are the foundational cornerstones not only of classical liberalism, but also of contemporary progressiveness. In a world where larger, more intrusive government is being advocated as a solution to global warming, our keynote speaker is showing true global leadership in pointing out the uncertainties in alarmist global warming theory and the certainty that restraining human liberty to pursue illusory global warming solutions will only cause an increase in global human misery. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce a true champion of sound science, personal freedom, and economic liberty, the President of the Czech Republic, Václav Klaus.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here. I would like first of all to thank the organizers of this important conference for making it possible and for inviting one politically incorrect politician from Central Europe to come and speak here. A politician who, as was just mentioned, in spite of his views on climate, was 2 weeks ago re-elected as the president of his country. And the point is that everyone in the Czech Republic knows my views on climate change, and I am, I think, a living demonstration of the fact that politicians can be elected with such views on climate change and things like that. So it's a good message, I would like to say. This meeting will undoubtedly make a significant contribution to the moving away from the irrational climate alarmism to the much-needed climate realism. I know it's difficult to say anything interesting and new after so many speeches and discussions here. But when I look around, there are not many speakers from former communist countries here. And I think as an economist, I always try to find my comparative advantages, and I think I have to use it as a comparative, paradoxically, advantage, not disadvantage. Each of us has his or her experiences, prejudices, preferences. The ones that I have are quite inevitably connected with the fact that I have spent most of my life under the communist regime. A week ago, I gave a speech at an official gathering at the Prague Castle commemorating the 60th anniversary of the 1948 communist putsch in the former Czechoslovakia. One of the arguments of my speech there, quoted in all the leading newspapers in the country the next morning, went as follows, and I quote, "Future dangers will not come from the same source. The ideology will be different. Its essence will nevertheless be identical. The attractive, pathetic, at first sight noble idea that transcends the individual in the name of the common good, on the one hand, and the enormous self-confidence on the side of its proponents about their right to sacrifice the man and his freedom in order to make this idea reality on the other. That was the 60th anniversary of the communist putsch. And being here yesterday morning, reading the excerpts from the Czech press yesterday morning, I discovered that the chairman of the Czech Green Party dramatically criticized this statement of mine. I think it's very good that he understood it. This fear of mine is the driving force behind my active involvement in the climate change debate and behind my being the only head of state who in September 2007 at the UN Climate Change Conference, only a few blocks away from here, openly and explicitly challenged the current global warming hysteria. My central argument was in a condensed form, formulated in the subtitle of my recently published book devoted to this topic, which asks, what is endangered, climate or freedom? And my answer is clear and resolute. It's our freedom, I may also add, and our prosperity. What frustrates me is the feeling that everything has already been said and published, that all rational arguments have been used, yet it still does not help. Global warming alarmism is marching on. The same formulation has been used here many, many times. We have therefore concentrated here and elsewhere, not only on adding new arguments to the already existing ones, but also on the winning of additional supporters of our views. The insurmountable problem, as I see it, lies in the political populism of its exponents and in their unwillingness to listen to arguments. They, in spite of their public roles, maximize their own private utility function, where utility is not any public good, but their own private good, power, prestige, career, income, and so on. It's difficult to motivate them differently. The only way out is to make the domain of their power over our lives much more limited. But this will be a different discussion, but necessary discussion. We have to repeatedly deal with the simple questions that have been many times discussed here and elsewhere. Is there a statistically significant global warming? If so, is it man-made? If we decide to stop it, is there anything a man can do about it? And eventually, should a moderate temperature increase bother us? We have our answers to these questions, and we are fortunate to have many well-known and respected experts who have made important contributions in answering them. Yet, I am not sure this is enough. People tend to blindly believe in the IPCC's conclusions, especially in the easier to understand formulations presented in the summaries for policymakers, despite the fact that from the very beginning, the IPCC has been a political rather than a scientific undertaking. Many politicians, media commentators, public intellectuals, bureaucrats in more and more influential international organizations not only accept them, but use them without qualifications which exist even in the IPCC documents. There are sometimes unexpected and, for me, unexplainable believers in these views. I will not comment the views of my fellow politicians. A few days ago, I have come across a lecture given by a very respected German economist who is, in his other writings, very critical of the German interventionist economic policies and etatist institutions. Nevertheless, his acceptance of the conventional IPCC wisdom, perhaps unwisdom, is striking. His words, I quote, "The scientific evidence is overwhelming. The facts are undeniable. The temperature is extremely sensitive to even small variations in greenhouse gas concentration. If greenhouse gases were absent from the atmosphere, average temperature of the Earth's surface would be -6 degrees Celsius. With the greenhouse gases, the present average temperature is +15 degrees. Therefore, that's the point, therefore, the impact of CO2 is enormous." But it's a very sophisticated, leading German economic professor. And he was even surprised that in spite of all the measures taken, emissions have accelerated in recent years. This poses a puzzle for economic theory. He said, to make it less of a puzzle, let me make 2 brief comments. As an economist, I have to start by stressing the obvious. Carbon dioxide emissions do not fall from heaven. Their volume is a function of GDP per capita, which means of the size of economic activity, of the number of people, and of the emissions intensity, which is the amount of CO2 emissions per dollar of GDP. This is a well-known, simple relationship, which I will not describe here. But what this relationship tells us is very simple. If we really want to decrease the emissions, CO2 emissions, which I suppose most of us assembled here today probably do not consider necessary, but if we really want to do it, we have to either stop the economic growth and thus block further rise in the standards of living, or to stop the population growth, or make miracles with the emissions intensity. Nothing else. I'm afraid there are people who really want to stop the economic growth, the rise in the standard of living, though not their own, and the ability of men to use the expanding wealth, science, and technology for solving the actual pressing problems of mankind, especially of the developing countries. This ambition goes very much against the past human experience, which has always been connected with a strong motivation to go ahead and to better human conditions. There is no reason to make the from above orchestrated change just now, especially with arguments based on such an incomplete and faulty science as is demonstrated by the IPCC. Human wants are unlimited and should stay so. Asceticism is a respectable individual attitude, but should not be forcefully imposed upon the rest of us. I am also afraid that the same people imprisoned in the Malthusian tenets and in their own megalomaniac ambitions want to regulate and restrain the demographic development, which is something only the totalitarian regimes have until now dared to think about or experiment with. Without resisting it, we would find ourselves on the slippery road to serfdom. The freedom to have children without regulation and control is one of the undisputable human rights, and we have to say very loudly that we do respect it and will do so in the future as well. There are people among the global warming alarmists who would protest against being included in any of these categories, but who do call for a radical decrease in carbon dioxide emissions. It can be achieved only by means of a radical decline in the emissions intensity. This is surprising because we, assembled here, probably believe in technical progress more than our opponents. We know, however, that such revolutions in economic efficiency and emissions intensity is part of it, have never been realized in the past and will not happen in the future either. To expect anything like that is a non-serious speculation. I recently looked at the European CO2 emissions data covering the period 1990-2005, which means the Kyoto Protocol era. My conclusion is that in spite of many opposite statements, the very robust relationship between CO2 emissions and the rate of economic growth can't be disputed, at least in a relevant and meaningful time horizon. You don't need huge computer models to very easily distinguish 3 different types of countries in Europe. On the one hand, the EU less developed countries, Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, which during this very period try to catch up with the economic performance of the more developed EU countries, this one group. Their rapid economic growth led to the increase of their CO2 emissions in 15 years in which they signed Kyoto by, and you will be surprised, by 53%, plus 53% increase in the last 15 years. That's one group of European countries. Second group, the European post-communist countries like the Czech Republic, which after the fall of communism went through a fundamental, voluntarily unorganizable transformation shakeout and an inevitable radical economic restructuring with the heavy industry disappearing. And when I say disappearing, I don't mean stagnating or retreating, simply heavy industry disappearing practically overnight. Their GDP drastically declined. The Czech Republic was the most successful in this respect, but the GDP decline at the beginning of the 1990s was 1/5 of the GDP. So and it was the lowest decline. All the other countries went down much, much more. And so these countries with such a radical economic restructuring decreased their CO2 emissions in the same period by 32%. So the differences are fascinating almost. The normal EU slow-growing, if not stagnating countries, excluding Germany, where it is difficult to eliminate the impact of the fact that the East German economy almost ceased to exist in that period. And it's difficult to adjust the data. So the slow-growing EU countries increased their CO2 emissions in the same period by 4%. I would say that the huge differences in these 3 figures, plus 53%, minus 32%, and plus 4%, are almost fascinating. And yet, there is a dream among European politicians to reduce CO2 emissions for the entire EU by 30% in the next 13 years. What does it mean? Do they assume that all countries would undergo a similar economic shock as was experienced by the Central and Eastern European countries after the fall of communism? I guess not. Now, in the whole of Europe, Do they assume that, that European economically weaker countries would stop their catching up process? Or do they intend to organize a decrease in the number of people living in Europe? Or do they expect a miracle in the development of the emissions GDP ratio, which would require a technological revolution of unheard of proportions with the help of from Brussels organized scientific and technological revolution? You know, you are laughing, but for us who lived in a communist era, the term scientific and technological revolution has a very special meaning. It was the idea of Mr. Leonid Brezhnev at the beginning of the 1970s, when he and others discovered that the catching up process with the developed West is impossible, and instead of changing the regime, changing the system, he came with the idea of scientific and technological revolution. So for me, it has a very special substance, this term. What I see in Europe and in the US and other countries as well is a powerful combination of irresponsibility, of wishful thinking, of implicit believing in some form of Malthusianism, of cynical approach of those who themselves are sufficiently well off, together with the strong belief in the possibility of changing the economic nature of things through a radical political project. This brings me to politics. As a politician who personally experienced communist central planning of all kinds of human activities, I feel obliged to bring back the already almost forgotten arguments used in the famous plan versus market debate in the 1930s in economic theory. Some of you may know the story between Mises and Hayek on the one hand and Lange and Lerner on the other. The arguments we had been using for decades, till the moment of the fall of communism. Then they were quickly forgotten. The innocence with which climate alarmists and their fellow travelers in politics and media now present and justify their ambitions to mastermind human society belongs to the same fatal conceit, in the terms of Friedrich von Hayek. To my great despair, this is not sufficiently challenged, neither in the field of social sciences nor in the field of climatology. Especially the social sciences are suspiciously silent, and I would add, even here at this conference. The climate alarmists believe in their own omnipotency. They believe in knowing better than millions of rationally behaving men and women what is right or wrong. They believe in their own ability to assemble all relevant data into their Central Climate Change Regulatory Office, equipped with huge supercomputers. And they believe in the possibility to give adequate instructions to hundreds of millions of individuals and institutions. And they believe in the non-existence of an incentive problem and the resulting compliance or non-compliance of those who are supposed to follow these instructions. I'm afraid we have to restart the discussion about the very nature of government and about the relationship between the individual and society. Now it concerns the whole mankind, not just the citizens of one particular country. To discuss this means to look at the already canonically structured theoretical discussion about socialism or communism and to learn the uncompromising lesson from the inevitable collapse of communism 18 years ago. To sum up, it is not about climatology, it's about freedom. This should be the main message of our conference. Thank you very much for your